everyone to this month's Mars Bart lecture series. Of course, during the pandemic, we've been able to have two a month, which is really nice. Emily Perkins is joining us from the Historic New Orleans collection. She kind of stumbled upon this document and created a whole lecture series based around it. Emily is a curatorial cataloger at the Historic New Orleans collection. We've had a number of fascinating talks and over the years from the collection, people coming out and talking about different topics. So Emily is going to talk to us about something that is quite familiar to us at this time, about quarantines and the way they've been treated over the years, but tied in with the wonderful history of New Orleans and the bananas and the influenza epidemic in the early 1900s. So take it away, Emily. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for having me, and thank you for everybody coming out today from your homes to listen to me talk about this awesome object. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my work at HNOC and the Historic New Orleans Collection. I'll call it HNOC. And kind of how I stumbled upon this object, why I stumbled upon it, and what inspired me to write more about it. So this is a little different than a lot of lectures that I've given in the past. I'm an archivist by training. I'll talk about that a little more later, but I've done some that are a little bit more technical. This might be my first history object focused piece, more content focused. So I'm looking forward to trying something a little different. And I'm just going to be talking to y'all a lot today about my process. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Bananas, Yellow Fever, and the Quarantine Tour of 1906. Got a picture from that scrapbook here today. So you guys might be familiar with the Historic New Orleans collection. I work at the Williams Research Center, which is over on Charter Street. And this is the research library portion of the many, many different things that HNOC does. We are a museum, a publisher. We have educational materials. We've been doing lots of online content lately, but we also have a vast archive of somewhere in the ballpark of about 500,000 objects. And what I do as a cataloger is I work with a database all day. I describe objects that are in our collection, and I make them findable for researchers. We have this gorgeous reading room up here on the left. I work right underneath this room. And this is our database on the right. This is how it appears to the public. We call it our Online Public Access Catalog, the OPAC. And the back end that I work with is called a Collections Management System, a CMS. We have 3 different types of materials and the way that we kind of split up the work in the cataloging department. So there's the library collection, that's obviously printed, published books, pamphlets, things like that. We have lots of rare books and they're arranged by subject, but it's not a circulating library. You have to go and actually request the book and view it in-house. We also have a manuscript collection, which is papers produced by a person or an entity that is then donated to our archive. And we are a private collection, which means that we only have materials that were donated by people. We don't collect the records of the city of New Orleans, for instance. Lots of people will come to us looking for land records, and unless it was given to us by a specific collector, we don't really have that kind of thing. That's more something that the New Orleans Public Library or the notarial archives would have. And then we have what's called our curatorial collection, and that is really everything else. On the right, it's things like photography, prints, paintings, drawings. Documents would be more manuscripts, but I work with maps, all kinds of things that are called curatorial because they're more often items that are put on display and part of our curated exhibitions. So the writing that I've been doing really came about when HNOC started a first draft blog, where they encourage staff to write about things that we find and about our work, and kind of just to share it with the public to, in my case, encourage people to come and patronize our archive and see what kind of stuff we have and do research with us. I've written a few pieces about just cool stuff I find while I'm working, like some 70s R&B performing art posters from the Michael P. Smith collection. I wrote a piece about a WPA era photograph of the French market that was very interesting. And most recently, I wrote a piece about canceled Carnival. It's been canceled 14 times in the past. My colleague, Catherine Dunn, and I wrote a rough timeline and outlining the reasons that each was canceled and kind of what happened that year. That's been getting a lot of media attention lately. That's been exciting. It's been kind of referenced and cited in local and national sources. So that's been really exciting for us. You can view them all on the First Draft webpage. You can find that on the HNOC website. So a little bit about me. I was born and raised here in New Orleans. I have a bachelor's in history from LSU, and I went to the University of Texas for what was called information studies, which is kind of the digital era equivalent of a library school degree. I focused on archives, and I have held the position as archivist before, but no one at HNOC actually has that title. As an archivist, my job is to be transparent. I'm to make information accessible to others. I really don't do a lot of curation or extensive research per se. I'm going to use this word a lot today. I do contextual cataloging and object-based research. That's exactly what this scrapbook was for me. It's researching the specific object. So that is to say that I am not an expert on bananas. I'm not an expert on United Fruit. I'm not an expert on yellow fever, but I am an expert on this specific scrapbook. So I am excited to share with y'all what I learned while working with this object. So the way I came to it is I'm sort of reviewing things that are in our collections and making sure that they're housed properly, that they're not falling apart as fast as they possibly can, and making sure that they're usable and findable for researchers in that online access catalog. So this is a scrapbook slash photo album slash, we call them bound works. These are things that come to us already bound. And this is part of the review process that I've been doing to assess how they're stored. This is the piece. It's on a book cradle, so it's very delicate. It's not in great shape. It came to us in 1996. So this is a book cradle that just makes sure the binding doesn't crack. And I'm going to just talk to y'all a little bit about scrapbooks and how they're kind of an archivist's dream and our worst nightmare. I'll start with the nightmare. So we are involved in material preservation. And what you absolutely don't want is lots of kinds of materials shoved in together. And that is what a scrapbook is. It has photographs, it has printing ink, it has usually really low quality paper. As you can see here, it's really falling apart. I mean, this is 110, 120 years old almost, so it's to be expected. But you have leather, paper, photographs. These are silver gelatin prints. I'm going to talk a little bit about deterioration processes. It's called silver mirroring. So usually what we would do with this kind of object is disassemble it. We would take out these photographs and store them in archival mylar sleeves in their separate box and maybe just chuck the scrapbook. But that's absolutely not what we wanted to do with this one, because the flip side of a scrapbook being a nightmare is that they're also kind of a dream, because a lot of what I have to do is reverse engineering an object to figure out how it was made, who made it, why it was made, and why we have it. But this scrapbook and scrapbooks like it has all of that information for me. We call this metadata. It's data about data, but this is like kind of all of the context was there for me. And so it's not worth it in this instance to separate everything, because you're really losing all of that history and all of that context, which is what makes it interesting. So it was put together like very intentionally. This isn't something that me as an archivist trying to be transparent, I would want to really jumble up. But say this was just a 20th century scrapbook of family photos of little 4x6 prints, that one we might take apart. But this one we decided to keep together. This is where digitization comes into play. So this scrapbook has been fully digitized, which means we have digital images of every single page and the cover and the inside cover, so that I have here end user experience. 1996, digitization wasn't where it is today. So the object probably wasn't photographed until the early 2000s. And that is what we are going to focus on preserving at this point. The scrapbook we're keeping in an archival box so that we kind of mitigate the danger as much as we can, but it's only downhill from here. That's just the way that material preservation goes. So digitization gives us a way to both provide access to a fragile object and to people who can't come to our archive, and to focus more on that than something that is inherently unstable. And I would like to show you guys what I mean by silver mirroring. So I'm not saying that I understand the chemistry of this picture, but this is a process known as oxidation. So this image on the top left just shows that there are several layers to a silver gelatin print. There's the paper base and this little AG, that's a little bit of silver that when exposed to, I think the E would be like humidity or other pollutants, it can actually pull the silver out and it kind of resettles on the surface and makes this hazy, shiny glaze that kind of ruins the image. So you can see this one on the right isn't from this scrapbook, but it's a good example of silver mirroring. And it may be partially due to the fact that it's mounted in a poor quality paper, acidic paper mount. So those two materials interacting will kind of damage the print. So that's definitely happening in this scrapbook. And it's something that we don't like to see, but it's like going to happen with silver gelatin prints of this age. Real quick, I want to show you guys what the scrapbook looks like in a digital format. And so I want to see if I can stop sharing and then share this screen. Right. So everybody sees the catalog record. I just want to show you that it is possible through our catalog to flip through each page as if you were looking at the original scrapbook. This is part of the work that I did to make sure that all of the records are listed in the order that they appear in the scrapbook. So we're going to take a look at a lot of these pages today, but I just wanted to show you that this is something that's possible with digitization, so that we can minimize the actual contact with an object that is this fragile. So this is great. This is where a lot of museums and archives are heading in terms of digital access. And this is what the scrapbook record looks like. Everything that's blue is hyperlinked text, which means that you can jump to other things that we have in our catalog that are related to travel, commerce, industry, and agriculture. And then it has every single page listed underneath it. And this was quite a lot of work to get these in order. But this would be the page that is linked in the original article that you can go to, and you can either flip through every page, or if you know you're interested in this specific image, you can jump to that from here. Go back to the PowerPoint now. All right. So earlier I said the term contextual cataloging, and that scrapbooks can be a archivist dream. This one was great because a lot of the questions that I have were answered for me right there in the scrapbook, like who, when, what, and how. There is a page at the back of the book with every single person involved on the tour signed the page. There's tons of group photos that help me with identifications printed at the bottom that help me to know who this was associated with. And I record all those names and make records for them. When was amazing because they had this little itinerary printed at the top. So I knew exactly down to the date and the time of when each photo was taken. There was lots of text pages in this scrapbook. That the front one describes the subject of the trip, and it explains what this scrapbook represents and why it was made. And then how it was made is printed at the back, where he thanks specific people that were involved with the making of this scrapbook. One of the biggest questions I had was, why is the Picayune printed on the page, on the front page of the scrapbook? And that is what I will get into next. So there were lots of subjects that came up to help me kind of better understand the scrapbook. And again, what I was saying is I'm supposed to provide access to the information. I don't necessarily need to understand and explain every single one. I just want to make it findable to people who are interested in topics such as yellow fever and quarantines, public health and sanitation, local commerce and the press, and New Orleans and their relationship with Central America. So as I started to look into these topics, the coronavirus pandemic hit and I was beginning to work from home. So obviously I got really interested in the topic of quarantines and yellow fever. And I personally love the Zoom format. I think it makes it so much easier to attend lectures such as this. There was one that I attended, I think it was the Herman Grimme or Gallier House. This local scholar, Owen Ever, gave a presentation about quarantines in New Orleans, and he talked a lot about yellow fever, which I came to understand really plagued New Orleans almost yearly for all of the 19th century, starting as early as the 1790s and then ending about with this tour in 1905. So he talked a lot about misconceptions surrounding yellow fever before the cause was discovered, which it was discovered in about 1900. There were beliefs that it was caused by miasma and the theory that it was bad air and you would need to purify the air to rid it of yellow fever. And it wasn't necessarily an airborne illness, so that wasn't correct. And then there was another one called importation theory that held that it was being brought by people aboard ships. And while not entirely incorrect, because it was brought by mosquitoes biting people infected on those ships, this kind of led to a lot of xenophobia and a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric. And unfortunately, in New Orleans, there was a belief that African Americans were not affected by the disease. So, or locals were not affected either. So this did probably lead to a lot of underreporting. But this talk that I went to really helped to kind of open up a lot of like avenues for research for me to figure out more about yellow fever. The second topic was public health and sanitation. And I really got familiar with that in May when, for first draft, my colleague asked me to revisit an article written by a former HNOC historian named John McGill. Some of you might be familiar with him.
He spoke a while ago.
Oh, yeah. I love hearing him talk. He's one of my favorite speakers. He's always got a three-piece suit on. So he wrote this piece, I believe it's from a section of his dissertation about water management and water infrastructure in the late 19th century in New Orleans. And he really paints a picture of how disgusting New Orleans was in terms of gutters and modern sewage systems sort of started in America or were established in America by the 1880s, but New Orleans kind of lagged behind and we still relied on privies. Water for most public use was pumped straight from the Mississippi River. It was held in cisterns that were uncovered, which later turned out to be the perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes that carried yellow fever. So without understanding the connection, it took a long time for those improvements to come. They really started in 1897, and by about 1902, we were starting to get our first pumping stations that would pump wastewater out. This is also when the back swamp of New Orleans started to be drained and opened up new areas for settlement. So that article really helped to introduce me to and researching along with what John McGill wrote and then what I was reading as well, what kind of measures were taken in New Orleans surrounding yellow fever and what it was like. That article kind of focused on the period between 1878 and 1902 when those construction projects really started. So the next subject that I have listed is local commerce and the press. And one thing that I discovered in that sanitation piece was the Board of Health and the quarantine stations that they set up probably as early as the 1850s, if not before. But by 1878 had a fairly, after that pretty devastating year, had a fairly stringent quarantine protocol for all ocean going ships, whether coming in through the Regalies or up the river, would have to stop at a quarantine station. Passengers would be inspected by a doctor, and cargo holds were also fumigated with sulfur. And this was obviously a big problem for the fruit industry because large cargo holds were being fumigated with sulfur acid gas, and ruining cargo, either through fumigation or from the fact that they were delaying shipments of fruit that would go bad really quickly. And the final subject would be New Orleans's relationship with Central America, which is not something I'm very familiar with or was at the beginning of this. So I had quite a lot of learning to do on that front. So I've already listed some of these research methods that I've done while working from home. I showed y'all that picture. I work at this gorgeous research library, but without being able to be there every day, I've kind of had to figure out other ways of researching. Like I said, I'm a big fan of virtual lectures, writing that first draft blog article. I've been using our online catalog, which has lots of stuff related to these topics. But in terms of United Fruit history, our collection really focuses or has materials from a later period, about the 1930s or so. One of my favorite tools for both first draft articles I wrote is the New Orleans Public Library's newspaper database. I'll have a screenshot of that in a minute, but that really filled the gaps of, I'm sure you've heard the terms secondary and primary sources. If the secondary sources weren't focusing on the time period that I needed to look at, that's where the newspapers would come in as a first primary document that I could search through to see things about the ship quarantines. And I have lots of screenshots of news articles in a minute. I also read a lot of theses and dissertations, including John McGill's, several ones on water management, and a few on United Fruit's early eras. And I also did a lot of web article research. I'm a big auditory learner, so I found some great podcasts that I'm going to share with y'all today. And book excerpts on Google Books were also very helpful to me. So this is some of the research methods I had. Up here at the top left is a Throughline NPR podcast that I listened to several times, because unlike a lot of my research, it really focused on the foundations of United Fruit in Central America. It's called There Will Be Bananas. I definitely recommend anybody interested in this topic to check it out. I listened to another one recently that focuses on like the 20th century history of United Fruit, by the Harvard Business Review. It was called Cold Call, The Controversial History of United Fruit. That's another great one for anybody interested. At the bottom left, I have historic New Orleans newspapers, and this just shows the titles and the dates that are available. So there's the States item and the Times Picayune, which at the time I think was called the Picayune, but it fits into this 1837 to 1988. So I found a lot of sources in there, but it doesn't have every newspaper that New Orleans ever had. It definitely doesn't have Black newspapers, or I think French-speaking newspapers were still really a thing by the early 1900s, but that was a great source for me. And then here on the right is a map that we have in our collection of the United Fruit Company's steamship routes. And this is obviously later on that I'm looking at, but it's just an example of the kind of stuff we have and how it was almost relevant to my research, but not entirely helpful. So for anybody who needs it, I do too. Just a short geography review of Central America at the time. We have Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama were all on this tour. So this is a later map, so you can see they also had routes in Jamaica, in Havana, and in Colombia as well. But that's on a later period. So we're just looking at these 5 countries. And this map, I would like a researcher to help me understand why this map says British Honduras, when my understanding is that Honduran independence came in the 1830s or 1850s even. I can't remember. But at the time on this tour, they were referred to as Spanish and British Honduras. Let me just find where I am. I want to mention one other piece of yellow fever related research I did from our collection. I think in the 90s, HNOC published a book called Queen of the South that was based on the journals of Thomas K. Wharton. And that focuses on the yellow fever epidemic of the 1850s, which was definitely the worst year. I think you could say 1853 was the worst, 1878, and then to a lesser extent, this 1905 year. So the items we have in our collection, like this map, are related to the time period of Sam Zemurray. I'm not going to talk much about Sam Zemurray today because he's outside of the timeline. He took over as president of the United Fruit Company in the 1930s. So I'll talk a little bit about him at the end. But around this time, Zemurray he's a Russian Jewish immigrant, and he was a banana seller in New Orleans, selling bananas locally along train routes. And he was called Sam the Banana Man. He was involved with, I think he was president of a company called Cuyamel that went into Honduras after this time period I'm looking at, like in the 1910s and 20s, and then transitioned to the leader of United Fruit Company and brought them down to New Orleans. But this is all to say that I did have a little bit of a struggle to find material related to the 1900s, the aughts, 1900 to 1910. I think someone's unmuted, if you wouldn't mind muting it. But I'm going to share some photos of the scrapbook with y'all and talk a little bit more about my research process. So I began with researching the history of banana importation and the formation of the United Fruit Company in 1899, which was only 7 years before this scrapbook. And it turned out to be a story about transportation. This guy over here, Minor Keith, was a railroad magnate, and he began building railroads in Costa Rica as early as the 1870s and used bananas as a cheap food source to feed his workers. Many of these workers died of yellow fever in an era before knowledge of how it was spread. Poor sanitation and drainage, and poor living conditions led a lot of his workers to die of yellow fever. And that is also what spurred this improvement work, was a financial interest in improving working conditions. By the end of the construction of the train, so the one at the top left is the Costa Rica Railway, and he had built it buying land from the Costa Rican government in order to transport coffee for the government. But by the end of the construction in about the 1890s, he had shifted that model towards bananas. So he was transporting massive amounts of bananas to the port of Limon in Costa Rica and needed a network of steamships to bring that export to the United States, including New Orleans. So he approached Andrew Preston, who owned a fleet of refrigerated steamships. Refrigeration was a fairly new technology. Refrigerated steamships are referred to as reefers, and I believe 1905, they were still fairly new. So they teamed up, they formed United Fruit Company. Preston was also involved with the marketing of bananas. Bananas were introduced in America at the 1878 Philadelphia World's Fair, but they were still a pretty new thing. So Preston was involved with encouraging people to eat bananas in the United States, and they established routes. Sorry. They began importing these bananas into New York, Philadelphia, Boston, New Orleans, and Mobile. So these are two pictures of those railroads that really started the work. The one at the bottom left is in Guatemala, which was the last stop on their trip. So what I learned is basically that United Fruit would go into these countries, ingratiate themselves with the local government, buy up a lot of land, and build railroads or other civic services that ultimately were to serve their needs, but would kind of align themselves with the ruling classes in these countries. They would give a small cut of the profit, or however much a cut, to the leaders. But it wasn't a great arrangement for the local people, and a lot of them died from poor working conditions. And they started to get bad press about this. So that leads us to yellow fever in New Orleans in 1905. At this time, the cause of the disease was known, and the specific measures that could be taken are exemplified in this document on the left. This is from our collection. Mosquito bars, mosquito nettings, fumigating with sulfur was still very common, and covering cisterns so that breeding grounds for mosquitoes would be eliminated. This was a big campaign in New Orleans, and a lot of this was achieved before the outbreak in 1905. On the right, you can see a map of the outbreak, and you can see that the French Quarter was really hard hit. All right, excuse me. So about the fumigation, this is something that I came across from the sanitation first draft piece. On the right, you see an image from the newspaper of fumigating an ocean liner with sulfur. And on the left, you can see an article in the States item of the fruit dealers protesting this action from the Board of Health. This is kind of the event. The cargo, consisting of bunches of bananas and lots of coconuts, was damaged by the action and valued at $8,500. So that's a lot of money back then. And this started the kind of war between local commerce, in this case, the fruit industry, and the Board of Health. And this is something that we see continuing to play out into 1905. Another resource that I used a lot was the New Orleans Public Library has a list of yellow fever deaths. It's based on George Augustine's History of Yellow Fever from 1909. Let's see. So whether by rumor or by fact, there was a belief that since the city had done so much to stop the spread of yellow fever by 1905, that the outbreak had to come from somewhere else. It must have come from one of the shipping wharfs, and they traced the first case back to the Talia Street Wharf, which at the time was used exclusively by United Fruit. There were documented outbreaks in Belize and Panama, where United Fruit had plantations. So it looked really bad for them. And to stop the spread, the Board of Health issued a quarantine on all ships coming from Central America. And as we discussed earlier, fruit ships can't do quarantines. The fruit will spoil. So it really derailed their whole business. There was a fear at the time that if New Orleans closed business with Central America, that we would lose the fruit industry, that it would move to Mobile or back to the East Coast. So this is when the point in the story when Crawford H. Ellis enters the picture. He is the manager of the United Fruit Company's New Orleans branch. And when the quarantine was instituted that really hurt his business, he took out a large defense in the newspaper where he says they had nothing to do with bringing yellow fever, and he threatened anybody saying so with criminal libel for slandering their business. This article lists all of the actions that they've taken to prevent the spread of yellow fever at their ports. There's first, second, third. It goes all the way to 10, 11, saying fruit vessels do not carry mosquitoes. We have doctors employed. We have hospitals. We've improved the drainage. He goes so far as to accuse a rival company coming out of Havana that is where the yellow fever came from. So it's kind of reads as, why are you punishing us for this other people's mistake? This wasn't us. And he's kind of threatening people who are saying that it is, that we're going to lose this industry if we keep saying this. So he decided that the next month, the best course of action was to take the health officials on a tour so that they could inspect the stations and the wharves and ports themselves. He took people from the Marine Hospital and the boards of health from Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas. The whole purpose of the trip was outlined in the newspaper. And I read, apparently the Marine Hospital service was being paid by the government of Honduras to help improve their drainage and help them out with yellow fever. This is a page from the Times-Picayune in right before the tour left on January 20th, 1906. And it just goes to show that the entire trip was well documented by the paper. People really followed along with this very closely. On the right is a page from the scrapbook showing the whole party. The photographer was a freelance photographer who worked for the Picayune at times. We also have a lot of images of him of carnival photography. But he was sending telegraphs back to the paper, updating them on their process. Here you can see the steamship that they rode called the Anselm. And the newspaper reported when they had seasickness, what they had for dinner, if they arrived, when they arrived, if they had good weather or not. So this was very closely followed in the paper, and that was a fun way to research it for me, so that I could read along in the newspaper, just looking at chronologically what was being reported. So really, this is a public relations tour. And I think they're doing a pretty good job so far of pointing out their innocence. But what I'd like to do now is just go through the scrapbook a bit. They're all arranged chronologically in the book, and this is definitely not all of the images. I've shown you guys how you can go to the record and scroll through it yourselves. I definitely encourage you to do so. But these text pages at the beginning of each section are really great. They're really helpful for explaining. I think these are taken from the health officials' reports. So this one would say that the Port of Limon is a small town, how many people they have, what their drainage system is like. Here on the right, you have a picture of the harbor and the pier and where the ship docks. that was of great concern of like, where is the ship docking and is how are people being scanned for yellow fever before they get to it. On the top left, you can see the quarantine island. In a lot of cases, the quarantine station was held away from the shore. So that's just a picture across the harbor. This was the first stop on the tour and was the company's first railroad in the area. So this is sort of their main point of entry for the company at this time. Um, as as United Fruit Company grew in the area, it shifted, but Costa Rica was their first place that they started to develop. These are photographs and a text page of the Republic of Panama. They had another quarantine island, and these just look like they're having a leisurely vacation, um, enjoying the tropical environment, um, certainly getting A plus first class treatment. And they also took an extensive tour of the Panama Canal while they were there. This was recently purchased from from France in 1904. I think it had been sold back to Panama and then purchased by the United States in 1904. The text page here gives a pretty thorough but brief history of the Panama Canal from about 1550 up until the purchase. And you can see here at the bottom left, this one titled Old French Machinery Still in Use. I found this fascinating. At the top left, there is a wireless telegraph station in Colon, Panama. So this was messages, probably Morse code that could be sent to ships traveling in the area. And then you have a hospital at the bottom center. This was the nicer of the two. So a lot of what the photographs were taken of were the harbor, the pier, any buildings associated with the company, as well as the hospitals that they've built, or just proof that there were hospitals to take care of sick people. And the text pages definitely, everyone mentions yellow fever, when the last outbreak was, how bad it was, or certainly if they didn't have yellow fever, that was definitely explained. So next they went to Nicaragua. There was a steamship company known as Bluefield Steamship Company that operated out of here that I think was headquartered in New Orleans. So you have a picture on the left of some native Nicaraguans with banana trees in the background, a view in the harbor. The text page just describes the geography of the region and how, owing to the distance to the town from the anchorage of the vessels, it is regarded as absolutely safe to carry on communication, even though fever should occur in the town proper. This text even refers to the area as a health resort to Central America, saying they had so little fever. In Honduras, they were treated to a band performance. Another image of native Hondurans marketing bananas. And this page as well, it also has the distinction of never having had a case of yellow fever, and owing to the particular location at the foot of the mountains on the seacoast with natural drainage to the sea, it is regarded as a very healthy point. Belize in Honduras was one of the places that did have an outbreak in 1905. So a lot of these photos focused on the hospitals. You have one at the top left and in the bottom center here. And I love this photograph of the nurses. So they focused on this type of photography in this place to show that they were really on top of the um, medical aspect. And then in Puerto Cortes, Honduras, you can see an image of them meeting with people in military dress in the bottom center. Here on the right, Crawford H. Ellis is meeting with the manager of the United Fruit Company in Honduras, whose name is H.M. Keith. And I tried to find out if he was a descendant of Minor Keith. He very well may have been. I know that Minor Keith did marry into politics in the region, but I couldn't find any real evidence of that. So I'd be interested if a researcher could do some more digging. And then on the bottom left, you can see an image of the Honduran Railroad. And then the last stop was in Guatemala. On the bottom left, you see a picture of the long shoreline and the native village, and a scene on the railroad. Here's a nice group photo. Everyone standing on the railroad. 250 inhabitants, very small. And they, again, focus a lot on the piers and the infrastructure in the region, which was part of the reason that Ellis took them on this tour, so they could see it firsthand. And then after this, they returned to New Orleans, where the PR campaign was a massive success. And trade was reopened, and United Fruit cemented its foothold as the Gulf Coast hub for fruit shipments, owing to their expertise in health and sanitary precautions. It did a lot for NOLA's relationships with Central America. They were doing work there that they could be proud of. It formed a partnership and reversed some of the xenophobia and fear of disease transmission that had been so prevalent. Here are two articles from this one on the left, shortly after their return. Found United Fruit Company alive to the sanitation of Central American ports touched. And a portrait of Ellis here, a better understanding all around the trip's greatest result. And then later in the year, just more praise for the sanitary advances that had been made in Central America on the part of the United Fruit Company. I wanted to put an image, and I forgot to put it in, but the feeling wasn't exactly mutual, and United Fruits remains a controversial business in Central America. They're both loved and hated. This is something that was talked about in that Throughline podcast that I mentioned earlier. They earned the moniker El Pulpo, which means octopus, for its tentacles and reach into politics of the region. And I'll talk a little bit about the immediate future of United Fruit in a bit. Before I say that, yellow fever was fully under control by 1906 in New Orleans, according to the press at least. So much that the Picayune claimed it was the healthiest city in America, which just 30 years ago was the complete opposite. So that may be a big claim. I don't know how to exactly confirm that, but there was a massive campaign to cover every cistern. You can see that in the top right, cistern inspection results figured. Over half of the city's cisterns were poorly screened and were fixed by December of 1906. And Stegomia is accepted as yellow fever breeder by board. So this is just evidence of the broad knowledge of how yellow fever was spread by that point. And this was really the final outbreak of yellow fever in New Orleans and in North America. It wasn't big compared to the 1878 and 1853 outbreaks, but it's the last significant outbreak in the Gulf South. So that leaves us to the future of United Fruit Company. So about 15 years after this, or maybe 25 years after this tour took place, Sam Zemurray took over, Sam the Banana Man, moving the company's headquarters to St. Charles Avenue in New Orleans. You can see the edifice right there. So 15 years later would be 1920. This was a time of more banana competition in New Orleans. So Standard Fruit Company, which is now Dole, began in New Orleans under a local man named Joe Vaccaro, known as the Ice King, for his refrigeration business. And Zemurray is a controversial figure. He continued the tradition of meddling in Central American politics that Minor Keith had started. He overthrew the government of Honduras in 1912, and most famously in 1954, when the CIA ousted the first democratically elected leader of Guatemala when he tried to repatriate land. This was seen as a communist uprising. So the CIA helped him overthrow that government. And Zemurray was also involved in American politics and lent steamships from the Great White Fleet, which was the name of their shipping fleet, to the United States government to be used in the Bay of Pigs. So this is not an era I know a lot about. I would definitely recommend this Rick Cohen book to read more about him. He's a big philanthropist in New Orleans, heavily involved in the construction of Tulane University, and you'll see his names around the city quite a lot. But that's why this scrapbook was so interesting to me, because it's an under-examined period in the company's history. And it's the connection with yellow fever was obviously just very timely to the coronavirus pandemic. And it's not an angle that I see discussed too much. Mostly when people talk about the controversy of United Fruit, they're talking about the 20th century actions of Zemurray. Another reason that I was interested in this is I am a member of a loosely banana themed Mardi Gras crew. So this is just a fun picture of us in front of United Fruit Company on St. Charles on Mardi Gras Day in 2019. And then there's me in front of the Historic New Orleans collection in my banana costume. Our slogan is "May your banana trees never freeze." So here is where you can read the full article if you haven't yet. It's on First Draft. It's also published in our quarterly magazine. And I would love to take any questions from you guys if you have any questions about my research or what we do at HNOC. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and just ask your question. Anyone? There we go. And we can see everyone. It's quite a thorough talk, so people may not have any questions. I'm curious, does anyone know when Belize became Belize and not British Honduras? I don't know the history of that. I'm sure it's all tied
Rachel?
up. Yes, Ronnie.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring up that there's a book when I was teaching medical students about the yellow fever epidemic in New Orleans in 1853. The book is called Sword and Pestilence. Are you familiar with that, Emily?
No, I haven't looked into that one. Like I said, I was avoiding so much stuff that was just 1853. But
Yeah,
I will definitely look in.
But it's a great book because the things that I remember with the miasma, what they would do is they would shoot cannons into the air because and what they would actually do is also burn oil from barrels. And all of these things actually created more of the mosquito action going on. And then there's a lovely story in that about the Howard Society of Friends, who
Yeah.
helped rescue a lot of the people, you know, to take care of them, especially the immigrants from Italy that were there at the time. So that's a wonderful book. I just thought I'd mention it. And Rich Cohen's book, The Fish That Ate the Whale, is the name of it.
Yeah.
Great book.
Mhm.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Yeah, those are great books. I recommend anyone look into those if you're looking into the 1850s or the 1930s.
Did someone have a question? I thought I heard a voice.
Rachel, in response to your question, British Honduras became known as Belize in 1973.
Oh, much later.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, anyone else? Well, thank you so much, Emily. This was fascinating, so relevant and always interesting. I love this type of history and following the trail of history. It just opens up so many interesting aspects of where we are today based on where we came from.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I definitely think that it's super relevant to what we're dealing with today. I even said in the article, if this was happening in 2020, maybe this would have been a social media campaign of look how great we're doing. But in this case, they had to
Right.
take a steamship down to Central America. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.